Now we are going over the melee DPS. We are going to look at what legendaries are they using, what covenants are they going for, which ones, if it's for the active ability, if it's because it's simply a matter of numbers and certain passives in the soulbind trees are going to be more performing, and if you are going to be picking certain legendaries because they synergize very well with their covenant ability, or if they are independent of each other and they simply happen to be the two best performing ones. Now, I have been indicted by the World of Warcraft jury of neglect towards survival and feral, so I am contractually obligated to mention them in this video. Let's start with survival. Now, something you will hear in the range DPS video as well, hunters are extremely boring when it comes to covenants because pretty much all the other covenants outside of Kyrian have been nerfed into irrelevancy for all three specs. Flayed Shot has been nerfed multiple times and it only synergized with marksmanship talent tree to begin with, so now it's basically gone. Chakram or Necrolord is also gone, nerfed multiple times. Wild Spirits has also been, let's say, fixed and has been made weaker, and it is only now better in AoE situations, whereas Kyrian Resonating Arrow is just better in all situations. The nature of the ability in and of itself, having only a 1 minute cooldown that increases your crit chance by 30%, and you can even compound on this effect with its respective conduit for even more straight up damage on top of the crit chance. It is just very powerful, and not just in one type of damage profile like Wild Spirits. This is going to be good for AoE, for single target, for cleave. It is just the to-go covenant right now. When it comes to legendaries for survival, again, similar this time to BM, they are pretty boring because they can go for Soulforge Embers, because numerically it is just well performing right now as an extra AoE ability on a 20-second cooldown, since essentially the cooldown of this legendary is tied to the cooldown of your flare. So you can use this pretty much in both single target and AoE purely because of the damage it does right now, but in the case of survival you can still go for Nezingueri's Trapping Apparatus and Wildfire Cluster. Wildfire Cluster is for AoE situations. Again, survival doesn't have many options when it comes to the talent setup. You will be playing with Guerrilla Tactics, you will be playing with, in AoE, Wildfire Infusion, so this legendary is going to be pretty nice in Mythic Plus. And for single target, an apparently worthless legendary, if you look at the other hunter specs, for survival becomes much better because survival has a lot of value pending on the amount of focus they can generate. Since, again, their entire build for single target revolves around Mungus Bite and spamming as many Mungus Bites as possible in the short window that increases its damage. So having this legendary massively increase your focus generation for a short while is just what you want for your single target window, which is why it is easily the best single target legendary. Now on to my next page of the contract, where I talk about Feral Druid. Now, as Feral goes, for the choice of their covenant, it's actually a toss-up. The general safe answer for your covenant as a Feral Druid is going to be Kyrian, although it is going to trigger many people, since, at least right now, the Kindred Spirits Covenant bonus damage that you and your DPS partner are going to exchange doesn't actually show up on Warcraft logs or your damage meter. I'm sure tons of people will be triggered by this. It is just the more safe covenant, all-purpose use. It is just an extra damage increase on a 1 minute cooldown. Other covenant abilities have their uses. You have Convoke the Spirits, of course, which is also very valuable. Still, it has also been, let's say, hotfixed, because now if you're feral, you're going to be casting Moonfires in Convoke the Spirits window with the Lunar Inspiration talent buff, even if you don't take Lunar Inspiration, so it's very good. But this is one of the more up-in-the-air picks for DPS specs. The Covenant choice for Feral. Again, the safe pick would be Kyrian. When you look at the legendaries, on the other hand, there is a similar situation that I mentioned already with Resto Druid, with Guardian Druid. You have two more specialized legendaries that you can go for. Drought of Deep Focus for single target because of your dot increase on a single target. Again, similar to the other druids. If you go for Necrolord and Adaptive Swarm, this is going to be even stronger. And then in Mythic Plus, you can go for something like Circle of Life and Death. Spreading your DOTs through the entire pack in Mythic Plus is going to gain exponential value through this legendary. Your all-purpose legendary, though, still remains Katai Courier. It hasn't really been changed, it hasn't really been buffed or fixed. It was, again, very strong since the start, since the get-go. It has remained the strongest legendary, pretty much for any type of content, since the effects are just beneficial for any type of damage profile you want to do, be it single target, AoE, cleave. it remains the better choice for Feral. Now, my contract has been fulfilled, I can move on. Now, talking about boring, talking about Hunter and their lack of choice due to overnerf, what better class to talk about than Rogue? The poor Rogue has essentially lost all of their Covenant choices in a King of the Hill nerf battle, where essentially only Kyrian and Nightfare are left. They reworked, Flagellation is not very exciting, and then Serrated Bone Spike, as expected. The OP Covenant for 3 months in the beta got nerfed into the ground and now it's dead. So right now all Rogue specs, all 3 of them at the same time, are just choosing for single target to go Kyrian for Echoing Reprimand. It is just a very handy 45-second cooldown where you get to chunk out a much higher finisher because of the extra combo points that is going to give. And then for Mythic Plus, you are going to go for Sepsis, simply because the value of Sepsis, which wasn't that much weaker than Echoing Reprimand in single target, of course, in Mythic Plus, with multiple mobs dying very quickly, you can always guarantee a shortened cooldown on the ability itself. So this is going to be up to you where you want to choose, especially after the nerfs to Pelagos as the Kyrian Soulbind. You have Korain for Nightfey, for Rogue performing better and being the overall strongest DPS pick as far as Soulbinds go. When it comes to Legendaries though, let's start mentioning that all 3 Rogue specs have access to Mark of the Master Assassin, an old return. It is still just fine, especially if you are undecided and you just want to go for all 3 specs at the same time. This is the legendary to go. If you are thinking about a specific spec though, for Assassination there is just one legendary, basically, which is Zoldyck Insignia. The Legion legendary returning is just very powerful Execute phase legendary. That's what you're going for as Assassination, which is particularly empowered because now you have an even better Execute option in the reworked Blindside, which is going to give you better Execute phase. So this is going to work very well. So this is going to work very nicely with it. We go over to Outlaw, and it's a similar situation to the Covenant system. A lot of their legendaries have gotten nerfed, to the point that Celerity now is the only survivor. Guile Charm is actually a pretty fun comparison because Celerity gives you 8% damage within your strongest burst window, whereas Guile Charm gives you a ramping up damage up to 10% and only lasts for 10 seconds. You know, which is just nonsensical, since Celerity is an 8% damage increase throughout the entire window of Adrenaline Rush, whereas Guile Charm is just a 10-second long 10% damage increase. This is one of the victims. This is sort of what can happen when you nerf a legendary, which had a purpose, and then you nerf it to the point that it loses its purpose and it's just weird and awkward to use. However, Celerity is not weird and is not awkward to use. It's very, very good for Outlaw and does exactly what you want, which is more damage in your burst window. For Subtlety, very easy and split situation. Akari's Soul Fragment is your single target focused legendary and Finality is your AoE focused legendary. Although when it comes to AoE, even at 2 targets, Finality starts overtaking Akari's Soul Fragment. The multiple times nerfed Akari's Soul Fragment. So I think that by the time the expansion will be going out and you will get, you know, Heroic Raid, Mythic Plus, pre-Mythic gear, Finality will have outscaled Akari's Soul Fragment. Particularly because remember, Subtlety's Mastery increases your finisher damage, which is exactly what Finality does. So those are the 2 options for sub-Rogue. I am overall a little bit disappointed at the Covenant choice for Rogue. Serrated Bone Spike had a pretty nice, you know, unique function. You had Flagellation, the reworked Flagellation could have worked as a extra burst window for all 3 specs, but the numbers right now are just not there. So I do hope they get some sort of bump up before Mythic Raid release to make them more viable. Or maybe not, because then it's gonna trigger people who haven't gone that Covenant, so I don't fucking know. Now, on to Warrior. You know, when we talk about Warrior, ever since months and months ago when we first saw some sneak peek of the Covenant abilities, Condemn was a highlight for Warrior. An even stronger Execute, you know. You are, as a niche for your DPS damage profile, an Execute spec, an Execute phase spec, so this ability was very exciting. Now, it's been months since then. The ability hasn't been changed much. It has been made slightly stronger just for arms, since Fury has the ability to also AoE with Execute, unlike arms. But the general notion is that Ventir is going to remain your strongest Covenant choice, followed up by Kyrian as pretty much the only competition. Kyrian is your help for extra AoE burst, is your help for AoE in general. It doesn't offer that much in single target compared to Condemned. It is somewhat stronger when it comes to AoE and Mythic Plus, since this is generally what we're talking about. Stronger for arms than it is for Fury. This is mostly due to the fact that Fury has access to Whirlwind, that the Fury version of Whirlwind is also going to make your next two single target melee attacks strike up additional targets, meaning that Condemn can work with Whirlwind, whereas Arms doesn't have that option. Arms does have their Warbreaker into Bladestorm combo, but after that they do lack any other sort of sustained AoE. They have to go for something weaker like Cleave, like Sweeping Strike, which is not as effective as the sustained damage of the Whirlwind AoE of Fury. And for single target, in both specs, Condemn is easily the strongest one. Even if you consider numbers-wise the Kyrian Covenant being closer to Condemn, you still have to remember that you are, as a niche, an execute spec. This is what you're picked for in raid encounters. Outside of your shout and your rallying cry, that's your job, to do execute damage. So weakening your core strongest point of your damage profile just to get more overall damage with some AoE Spear of Bastion is not really what's going to make you more wanted. There are going to be plenty more specs with better AoE than you, with better burst AoE than you. Spear of Bastion is not going to change much. So in my opinion, you should just compound yourself on what your strength is, which is execute phase, on single target. But more objectively, this is where we are at with Warrior. Ventir with Condemned and Kyrian for Spear of Bastion. When we look at the legendaries, both specs have the options to go for the Signet of Tormented Kings, so your extra cooldown at reduced effectiveness being procced by this legendary. This is very easy to use for Arms because Arms doesn't have Enrage to keep up. When it comes to Fury, it's a little bit harder, to be able to slot in the Recklessness effect with the Enrage, making sure that the Enrage can stay up for the entire duration of your Bladestorm or Ravager. In both cases, it does remain for both specs a strong AoE legendary. For single target, Arms can still go for this legendary because of the ease they have in using this legendary with their Bladestorm. Arms can still use this legendary for single target, or they can go for Exploiter for the extra damage in the windows where Condemned is usable. Now, it's worth mentioning that given the scaling and the haste you will gain over time, you can enter a situation where you will basically get so fast with your generation that you will be able to just spam execute during the execute phase, and essentially Exploiter will be a DPS loss to begin with, so we will have to see if that's going to happen again. But for now, at lower gear, at lower haste, it is still a very strong single target legendary for your niche, for your execute. For Fury, on the other hand, your single target is going to be Deathmaker, your legendary. It is rather straightforward in its usage. It's not going to change too much of what you want to do, it's just going to be flat out more damage. So this is what we are left with for Warriors. Now on to another plate spec, Retribution Paladin. Very quick because this is very similar to Protection Paladin. The two best covenants are Ashen Hallow and Divine Toll, for the same reasons of Prot Paladin. Vanquisher's Hammer is just undertuned and not as effective, and the Blessing of Seasons is a meme. Ashen Hallow is going to be very strong if you want to go for one mega burst. If there is going to be in raid encounters two crucial damage windows, you can go for Ashen Hallow. You can pair it up with a legendary, which we will see soon, to empower your Hammer of Wrath even more, on top of the double damage it does. In Mythic Plus, this is much harder to use. 30-second long windows in Mythic Plus are not very easy to pull off in a single pack, and then a 4-minute cooldown is massive, so you go for Kyrian. Very easy and simple to use, a 1-minute cooldown, extremely powerful in AoE. When it comes to legendaries, you have for AoE a return of a trait from Legion, Tempest of the Lightbringer, for extra Divine Storm damage. It has been changed now. Now the extra splash damage is going to hit all targets and not just 6, which is the cap of Divine Storm. When it comes to single target, instead you have just way more options. You have the Med Paragon and Vanguard's Momentum, which are going to synergize with your Hammer of Wrath. They're going to synergize with your Ashen Hallow as well. Or you have the more standard and easy, similar to Prot, Relentless Inquisitor for just extra haste. Since, again, low gear, low stats, getting a bump up in haste for free from a legendary is very helpful. Now, on to the last of our plate users, we have Death Knight. When it comes to Death Knight, the strongest covenant is Ventir. Quite simply, Swarming Mist, it is just too good. Not just because of the damage it does, which is okay, even in single target, although that's not what you use it for. Also because of the runic power generation, every time it deals damage to every target. This is obviously very powerful in AoE for both specs. Unholy and Frost want this for the same reason. Unholy wants to get a ton of runic power in AoE, so they can spam Epidemic for AoE damage, whereas Frost DKs want to use Breath of Sindragosa, so they want tons of runic power from Swarming Mist. The very short cooldown makes it even more powerful because it's going to be up every single, burst rotation of Unholy and Frost, so it's the no-brainer choice for AoE. When it comes to single target, for Unholy DK and Frost, it can still be taken in single target just fine. The other option though, which is more single target specific and loses way more heavily in AoE, is going to be Kyrian and Shackle the Unworthy. This is particularly stronger for Frost DK than it is for Unholy. Frost DK, going for Kyrian, of course you have access to Pelagos, the strongest soulbind. You can take in your two-handed setup. For single target you will have Obliteration, guaranteeing you a series of killing machine procs for your Obliterate. This means that when you use Shackle the Unworthy, you proc Combat Meditation for more mastery, which is more Frost damage. You will also be using Pillar of Frost because it has a 1-minute cooldown, perfectly lining up with Shackle the Unworthy. And then you will benefit from your Obliteration talent giving you a ton of killing machines, which turns Obliterate damage into Frost. Because of the Mastery passive that you have procced by casting Shackle the Unworthy, you have a very powerful burst window for single target. In general, the more safe choice for both specs is going to be Ventir. In general, the more usable choice is going to be Ventir in all situations. You also have to consider that when we say stronger in raids, or stronger in Mythic Plus, or stronger in AoE versus single target, there are still going to be quite a few fights in Castle Natria where the importance, yes, will be single target damage, but that single target is going to be surrounded by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 smaller, less important mobs. These smaller, less important mobs will still allow Swarming Mist to do its job in terms of runic power generation, so its value will not be as weak as you would expect when you compare it to a single target Covenant like Kyrian's. When we look at Legendaries on the other hand, I have gone over both Unholy and Frost before a couple of times and it hasn't changed that much. Unholy is the same as my original video for Unholy. For single target you have Deadliest Coil, and for AoE you have Frenzied Monstrosity. Deadliest Coil also makes, of course, your Swarming Mist even stronger when you go for Ventir, because this is going to mean way more runic power generation thanks to Swarming Mist, which means more effectiveness of your Deadliest Coil legendary. When it comes to Frost, Koltir's Favor remains the strongest single target pick, even when you're not going for the two-handed single target oriented build, but you're going for the dual wield Breath of Sindragosa AoE style. This is still strong because refunding runes is going to be very powerful for your breath window, since it's going to generate a bunch of runic power to keep you in Breath of Sindragosa. For Mythic Plus, you have a couple of options. The Chad option to be all style to cut a very big cooldown in half, and then the more sustained damage, the more interactive one is going to be Biting Cold. Not just increasing the damage of your Remorseless Winter, which is going to be up pretty much all the time, but also giving you Rime, which is very good to start a pull with in Mythic Plus. To basically always have a guaranteed proc of Rime when you start a new pull in Mythic Plus. So this is the situation for Death Knight right now. I think it's a pretty healthy one. There is some nice diversity for Legendaries and the two options in Covenants. It is more than some specs could say, being able to choose between two Covenants, so I think they're doing fine. Now we go over Enhancement Shaman. Now, when it comes to Enhancement, unfortunately, they have been left out of all the fun. Primordial Wave is a super cool ability for Elemental and for Restoration, and it sucks dick for Enhancement, which means they are left choosing one of the three rather boring click-on cooldown AoE abilities. The Night Phase Fate Transfusion is terrible because it makes you channel an ability as a melee DPS, which is god-awful. Even when they gave you guaranteed generation of Maelstrom stacks, it's still just very annoying to use, so you're left choosing between Kyrian and Ventir. Same thing I said for Restoration. Chain Harvest is just easier to use, whereas Vesper Totem can yield better results if you can guarantee it hits all the targets. When it comes to Legendaries, the strongest Legendary that has ruled the beta for a while has gotten nerfed, and then Doomwinds has gotten some changes that now has made it the strongest Legendary. If you're not too up to date with the way Enhancement works, this is a very strong Legendary because your Maelstrom weapon stacks, which is what you use to cast instant Lightning Bolt or Chain Lightning with much empowered damage, are generated by your auto attacks and your attacks, meaning that when you use Doomwinds, talented with Forceful Winds, you have a guaranteed chance to proc Wind Fury weapon, which is going to make you swim in Maelstrom weapon stacks, on top of the extra damage buff for 12 seconds on just a 1-minute cooldown. Also, this is a good Legendary because it's going to make you remember to drop down the fucking Wind Fury totem. A good Legendary that you can still use as an alternative and might become more powerful in raids is going to be the Witch Doctor's Wolf Bones, because something I mentioned for a lot of time, they have finally buffed Feral Spirits. They gave it a 250% attack power scaling, as well as the Maelstrom stack generation guaranteed, so having Witch Doctor's Wolf Bones reduce the cooldown of Feral Spirit is going to be very powerful. It's going to be even more powerful when you will be able to use 2 legendaries at the same time, using Forceful Wind, using Doom Winds to give you a massive amount of Maelstrom weapon stacks that you can spend to further reduce the cooldown of Feral Spirit is going to be a very good combo for enhancement. Now we have Havoc. From my last pass of Havoc, not too much has changed in terms of priorities. When it comes to Covenants, you want to go for either Ventir or for Kyrian. You are significantly less interested in the Kyrian power that Vengeance instead wants, because the extra soul fragment generation of Elysian Decree is not that powerful for you. You don't care too much about defensiveness, because you don't have a talent that can reduce the cooldown of your sigils, because you haven't got sigils, and you don't have a legendary that can reduce the cooldown of your sigils when you consume souls, which makes Elysian Decree good just because of the AoE damage and nothing else. Yes, it's still powerful in Mythic Plus, but for single target you still want to go for Sinful Brand. Even after the continuous round of nerfs that Blizzard has thrown onto Sinful Brand, it is still going to be just fine for single target damage. For your legendaries, I went over this before, I explained this in depth. Chaos Theory is your best single target legendary by a mile. With your conduit for the double strike of Chaos Strike with your talent Cycle of Hatred, you will be able soon enough, with enough haste, to pretty much guarantee yourself a near constant uptime of your Furious Gaze Azerite trait, now cooked into your I-Beam, as well as a massively reduced cooldown of I-Beam. When it comes to Mythic Plus, you can choose the Chad way or you can choose the Virgin way. The Chad way is going for Dark Lair Boon. You know you can win that 20% roll and you can get your resets on your I-Beam. If you want to go the Virgin way, then you can simply take Collective Anguish. This is essentially going to double your I-Beam by also casting a Fell Devastation. So this is up to you. Now we move on to our last spec for melees, which is going to be Windwalker. You know, I made a video for Windwalker Monk as well, but we have some changes now. The main default legendaries, if you want to go purely for single target, is still Last Emperor's Capacitor, as mentioned before, and for Mythic Plus is still going to be Jade Ignition, as mentioned before. Now, the difference here. The difference is that Blizzard has chain buffed Invoker's Delight legendary. It started out as a 12% haste for 10 seconds, then 12% haste for 15 seconds, and then 20, and then 20% haste for 20 seconds, and now it's 33% haste for 20 seconds. So now it has made this legendary the all-round legendaries you can use in both single target or AoE, which is going to have a better effect than the others. Probably on par, if you want to, with Jade Ignition. Jade Ignition is going to work very well if you take the Dance of Chi-Ji legendary, which is going to give you a better reason, essentially, to use Spinning Crane Kick in your single target rotation. But those are your standout legendaries. When it comes to Covenants, it's going to be between Kyrian and Nightfey. Nightfey is going to be purely for AoE. Feline Stomp is very good as an extra consistent source of damage. It also works with your Mastery now, so it's going to get the extra damage cooked into the Mastery. But Kyrian is going to guarantee you to have a very strong cooldown. The extra Mastery gain is essentially extra damage from your abilities, as well as the Chi discount generated by your Rising Sun Kick. As you know, it is very powerful to stack cooldowns on top of each other. A 10% damage buff followed by a 10% damage buff is weaker than a 20% damage buff at the same time, which is why, if you go for Invoker's Delight legendary, Kyrian gains even more value, because you can stack those cooldowns together, and they are going to be even better. And because these two cooldowns are simply Mastery and Haste, they can be used in both single target or AoE, as opposed to the Nightfey's Feline Stomp purely being AoE centered. So this is why right now Invoker's Delight legendary together with Kyrian is just a more all-rounder for all-purpose damage for Windwalker. And we are done now with all the Melee DPS specs. Some standouts to me are the boredom of Rogue Covenants, especially because I dislike when one ability or Covenant or passive or talent is so powerful that it gets nerfed and then Blizzard isn't able to balance it to remain relevant and it gets completely forgotten. That's a little bit disappointing. On a similar vein, disappointed by Enhancement, considering how much flavor Primordial Wave has for the other two Shaman specs. It's a shame that Enhancement just doesn't follow up with that. But overall, we can still see that amongst Melee DPS there is a predominance of Kyrian and Ventir. Very, very few Necrolords have been recommended so far. Pretty much not even any melee DPS have had Necrolord being recommended, and just a handful of Night Fae. And even then as a possible option for AoE or for Mythic Plus. So let me know what you guys are rolling with your Covenants. Please stop ruining your chances at raid groups and Mythic Plus groups because you want to look cool. Just think of the future, please. So, I am leaving. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, Kyrian is still not nerfed, Blizzard.